Mitigating circumstances, Article 13 of the RPC Part 9. Provocation must originate from the offended party. Where the alleged provocation did not come from the deceased but from the latter's mother, the same may not be appreciated in favor of the accused. People vs. Reyes. A and B were together. A hit C on the head with a piece of stone from his slingshot and ran away. As he could not overtake A, C faced B and assaulted the latter. In this case, C is not entitled to this mitigating circumstance, because B never gave the provocation or took part in it. The reason for the requirement is that the law says that the provocation is on the part of the offended party. If during the fight between the accused and another person who provoked the affair, the deceased merely approached to separate them and did not give the accused any reason for attacking him, and in attacking the other person the accused killed the deceased, the provocation given by the other person cannot be taken as a mitigating circumstance. U.S. vs. Malabanan. Difference between sufficient provocation as requisite of incomplete self-defense and as a mitigating circumstance. Sufficient provocation as a requisite of incomplete self-defense is different from sufficient provocation as a mitigating circumstance. As an element of self-defense, it pertains to its absence on the part of the person defending himself, while as a mitigating circumstance, it pertains to its presence on the part of the offended party. People vs. Court of Appeals, et al. The provocation by the deceased in the first stage of the fight is not a mitigating circumstance when the accused killed him after he had fled. The provocation given by the deceased at the commencement of the fight is not a mitigating circumstance, where the deceased ran away and the accused killed him while fleeing. Because the deceased from the moment he fled did not give any provocation for the accused to pursue and to attack him. People vs. Alcanga. Provocation must be immediate to the commission of the crime. Between the provocation by the offended party and the commission of the crime by the person provoked, there should not be any interval of time. The reason for this requirement is that the law states that the provocation immediately preceded the act. When there is an interval of time between the provocation and the commission of the crime, the conduct of the offended party could not have excited the accused to the commission of the crime, he having had time to regain his reason and to exercise self-control. Provocation given by an adversary at the commencement and during the first stage of a fight cannot be considered as mitigating where the accused pursued and killed the former while fleeing, and the deceased, from the moment he had fled after the first stage of the fight to the moment he died, did not give any provocation for the accused to pursue, much less further attack him. People vs. 10. The provocation did not immediately precede the shooting. The accused had almost a day to mull over the alleged provocation before he reacted by shooting the victim. The inevitable conclusion is that he did not feel sufficiently provoked at the time the alleged provocation was made, and when he shot the victim the next day. It was a deliberate act of vengeance and not the natural reaction of a human being to immediately retaliate when provoked. People vs. Benito. But see the case of People vs. Degia, et al., where one of the accused, after the provocation by the deceased consisting in accusing him of having stolen 2 jackfruits from his tree and summarily taking them from the sled of the accused, went home and later returned fully armed and killed the deceased. Yet, it was held that the provocation should be considered in favor of the accused. There seems to be a misapplication of the rule in this case. This ruling would be correct if the accusation that the accused stole the jackfruits be considered as a grave offense instead of provocation. Because an interval of time between the grave offense and the commission of the crime is allowed in such a case. Threat immediately preceded the act. Thus, if A was threatened by B with bodily harm and because of the threat, A immediately attacked and injured B, there was a mitigating circumstance of threat immediately preceding the act. The threat should not be offensive and positively strong, because, if it is, the threat to inflict real injury is an unlawful aggression which may give rise to self-defense. U.S. v. Guy Sacco. Vague threats not sufficient. The victim's mere utterance, "If you do not agree, beware," without further proof that he was bent upon translating his vague threats into immediate action, is not sufficient. But where the victims shouted at the accused, "Follow us if you dare and we will kill you," there is sufficient threat. Basis of paragraph 4. The mitigating circumstance in paragraph 4 of Article 13 is based on the diminution of intelligence and intent. Paragraph 5. That the act was committed in the immediate vindication of a grave offense to the one committing the felony, delito, his spouse, ascendants, descendants, legitimate, natural or adopted brothers or sisters, or relatives by affinity within the same degrees. Requisites. 1. That there be a grave offense done to the one committing the felony, his spouse, ascendants, descendants, legitimate, natural or adopted brothers or sisters, or relatives by affinity within the same degrees. 2. That the felony is committed in vindication of such grave offense. A lapse of time is allowed between the vindication and the doing of the grave offense. Illustrations. 1. Being accused by the victim that the accused stole the former's rooster, which made the latter feel deeply embarrassed, and the encounter took place in about half an hour's time. People v. Pongal, citing People v. Libria. 2. Stabbing to death the son of the accused, which most naturally and logically must have enraged and obfuscated him, that, seized by that feeling of hatred and rancor, he stabbed indiscriminately the people around. People v. Doniego. A lapse of time is allowed between the grave offense and the vindication. The word immediate used in the English text is not the correct translation. The Spanish text uses próximo. The fact that the accused was slapped by the deceased in the presence of many persons a few hours before the former killed the latter was considered a mitigating circumstance that the act was committed in the immediate vindication of a grave offense. Although the grave offense, slapping of the accused by the deceased, which engendered perturbation of mind, was not so immediate, it was held that the influence thereof, by reason of its gravity and the circumstances under which it was inflicted, lasted until the moment the crime was committed. People v. Pirana. In the case of People v. Palin, unpublished, the killing of the paramour by the offended husband one day after the adultery was considered still proximate. In the case of People v. Diokno, the lapse of time between the grave offense, abducting the daughter of the accused by the deceased, and the vindication, killing of the deceased, was 2 or 3 days. In this case, the Supreme Court said, The presence of the fifth mitigating circumstance of Article 13 of the revised